Well, hey there everyone, welcome back. This is just a quick little intro and outro to this video because I actually just came back from the funeral of a beloved friend and I'm kind of emotional right now. So we're just gonna get to it here. This is on the best-selling novel of 1903, part of my continuing series, the best-selling American novel according to the publisher's weekly list, because that is the oldest list I could find. So caveats out of the way there. I will say that this dear friend, she was more of an acquaintance, I guess, but she was the sort of person who made a mark and just brought joy to everyone who knew her, and I wish I could be like that, but I'm not that outgoing. But apparently she was in a book club, so she would have appreciated this video, I think. So in any case, I bet you can't wait to find out what the book is. Let's get into it. Lady Rose's Daughter, written by Mrs. Humphrey Ward, aka Mary Augusta Ward, born June 11th, 1851 in Hobart, Tasmania. Her sister was the mother of writer Aldous Huxley. Her father was a school inspector, but then he joined the Roman Catholic Church, which proved to be a deeply unpopular move for his area and job together, so he up and moved the family to England. Mary wound up at various boarding schools in the Shropshire area under the care of her grandmother, returning home at age 16. She married Humphrey Ward in 1872 and continued her learning on her own, picking up the French, German, Italian, Latin, and Greek languages, followed closely by Spanish. Her first official efforts at writing involved researching members of the Spanish ecclesiastics for the Dictionary of Christian Biography. She was an early advocate for certain women's rights and was a member of the Lectures for Women Committee, which organized said lectures along with an optional written final exam. She dove into negotiations for the new women's college being built at Oxford and was appointed the first secretary of the Somerville College Council, serving even while heavily pregnant. Now, this is what makes her an interesting lady, in my opinion. She seems to have favored a separate but equal sort of philosophy. Many of her books contained allusions to Christian and/or Catholic faith and her favored Victorian values, and all that makes her seem highly conservative, and she in fact was a strong proponent of the anti-suffrage movement, although she wanted women to have a strong voice in local government nonetheless. At the same time, she claimed to aim for what she called equalization in society, creating several educational settlements where she worked as a teacher, aiming to work with and to teach the poor. In World War I, Teddy Roosevelt asked her to write a series of articles on British soldiers' everyday lives during the thick of warfare, so that they could bring that over to American audiences. She visited the soldiers in the actual trenches and produced 3 books on the subject. She died in 1920 in London. Her official writing career began with magazine articles, publishing her first children's book, Millie and Ollie, in 1881. In fiction, her works total 26 novels, along with 10 nonfiction titles to add to the mix. After her death, her diary was published anonymously, with the author being identified positively only in 2018. Lady Rose's Daughter was the author's 10th fiction novel, published by Harper & Brothers Publishers, New York and London, in 1903. The illustrations are once again by Howard Chandler Christie, which, dang, he was earning his money around this time. The book was adapted into a stage play the same year, and then into a film One Single Time, a silent in 1920 which is now considered lost, starring Elsie Ferguson and David Powell. It also featured Ida Waterman, who had appeared in the stage version. The film changed a few features of the novel, making the heroine unaware that her lover is engaged to another, and after being placed in a compromising situation, attempts to end her life, yet all that did not happen in the book. The novel itself is about said daughter of Lady Rose. It begins when said daughter, known as Julie Le Breton, having been raised in France, comes back to her mother's native England after the death of both her parents. She finds a position as companion to the aging Lady Henry,
but invokes the latter's jealousy when she proves to be a little too capable, particularly at being a hostess to those in society. After Lady Henry decides to kick her out, Julie must find out who her true friends are and figure out how to make her way in the world. Now, if you've read the book, this is really a very bad way of summing it up, but if I don't restrain myself, I do tend to go on, so I think this is for the best. Julie is an endearing and interesting heroine. You are not certain at the beginning whether she is sincere in her efforts and desires, or if maybe she's more a Becky Sharp type character. And even after you find out the answer, she's still a character who you get invested in. Now, it's not a perfect novel. It jumped into the society of everything a bit fast for me, and it was difficult to figure out which character was what. But if you stick with it, it's easier to understand what's going on with who. Of course, there ends up being a bit of a love triangle, with two fellows who Julie is or might fall in love with, one being the stand-up sympathetic dude you really want to root for, and one who's a downright rake, but still, he's sympathetic in his own way. And also, of course, it is a bit dated. Julie is the product of a mother who divorced her husband and ran off with another guy, and that just wasn't done then. Then there's when Julie very nearly makes a mistake that would doom her to society at large back then, for like the rest of her life, but wouldn't matter as much nowadays. There's much talk about the natural tendencies and weakness of womankind, so here you can see the author's ideals on full display, which I think serves as a reminder to check what you record as a writer. Because when you write something with such seeming definite sincerity, people will suppose that that is what you yourself believe. And in this case it's true, but in your case it may not be. It's okay to put on a voice for one story or another, but it's a good idea to think about it and tread carefully or accordingly. Now, although an engaging enough novel from start to finish, there were very few parts that really jumped out at me to share. The last part particularly is one of those that I feel is of its time. I'm thinking Little Women, though of course that came out many years before. But there seemed to be a tendency to have the characters relocate for a time to an idyllic setting somewhere in Europe, which is Italy in this case, and describe it in such detail that there can be no doubt that the author went there and is giving it some free advertising. So I won't read that part. Really, it's good, but you get the idea. Okay, for the first of several selections, we have Jacob Delafield considering the possible inevitability of his ascending to a dukedom, which he does not want. I find it interesting because I think a lot of us can sympathize with his position and would that more people in his position could do the same. A quick note, given the time this was written, the word queerness here does mean peculiarity, generally speaking. And so that other thought, which Jacob spent so much ingenuity in avoiding, rushed upon him unawares, the near inevitable expectation of the famous dukedom, which, in the case of almost any other man in England, must at least have quickened the blood with a natural excitement, produced in Delafield's mind a mere dull sense of approaching torment. Perhaps there was something non-sane in his repulsion, something that linked itself with his father's queerness, or the bigotry and fanaticism of his grandmother, the evangelical duchess, with her swarm of parsons, as Sir Wilfrid remembered her. The oddity, which had been violent or brutal in earlier generations, showed itself in him, one might have said, in radical transposition of values, a singularity of criterion, which the ordinary robust Englishman might very well dismiss with impatience as folly or cant. Yet it was neither, and the feeling had in truth its own logic and history. He had lived from his youth up among the pageants of rank and possession. They had no glamour for him. He realized their burdens, their ineffectiveness for all the more precious kinds of happiness. How could he not, with these two forlorn figures of Chudley and his boy always before him? As for imagination and poetry, Delafield, with a mind that was either positive or mystical, the mind, one might say, of the land agent or the saint, failed to see where they came in. Family tradition no doubt carries a thrill, but what thrill is there in the mere possession of a vast number of acres of land, of more houses, new and old, than any human being can possibly live in, of more money than any reasonable man can ever spend, and more responsibilities than he can ever meet? Such things often seem to Delafield pure calamity, mere burdens upon life and breath. That he could and must be forced some time by law and custom to take them up was nothing but a social barbarity. And here we have one of those passages which I feel really gives a clue as to the author's feelings and beliefs about life. And with a courteous authority and tact worthy of his trade, the old diplomat began to discuss the situation. Presently he found himself talking with an animation, a friendliness, an intimacy that surprised himself. What was there in the personality beside him that seemed to win away inside a man's defenses in spite of him? Much of what she had said had seemed to him arrogant or morbid, and yet, as she listened to him, with an evident dying down of passion, an evident forlornness, he felt in her that woman's weakness and timidity of which she had accused herself in relation to Lady Henry, and was somehow, manlike, softened and disarmed. She had been talking wildly because no doubt she felt herself in great difficulties. But when it was his turn to talk, she neither resented nor resisted what he had to say. The kinder he was, the more she yielded, almost eagerly at times, as though the thorniness of her own speech had hurt herself most, and there were behind it all a sad life and a sad heart that only asked in truth for a little sympathy and understanding. And here we have a glimpse into what makes Julie an interesting and layered character. We have a glimpse into her complicated feelings. And yet all the while she knew that it was an unreal and passing defiance. She would not be able in truth to free herself from the ambition to live and shine in this world of the English rich and well-born. For, after all, as she told herself with a rebellious passion, it was or ought to be her world. And yet her whole being was sore from the experiences of these 3 years with Lady Henry, from those, above all, of the preceding 24 hours. She wove no romance about herself. "I should have dismissed myself long ago," she would have said, contemptuously, to anyone who would have compelled the disclosure of her thoughts. But the long and miserable struggle of her self-love with Lady Henry's arrogance, of her gifts with her circumstances, the presence in this very world where she had gained so marked a personal success, of 2 clashing estimates of herself, both of which she perfectly understood, the one exalting her, the other merely implying the cool and secret judgment of persons who see the world as it is. These things made a heat and poison in her blood. She was not good enough, not desirable enough, to be the wife of the man she loved. Here was the plain fact that stung and stung. And for the last selection, here was a line that jumped out at me as quite charming. "Why is I always religious? I swear I'm not doing this on purpose." "You forget I'm a Catholic," said Julie, smiling rather doubtfully. "Are you, Julie? I'd forgotten. The good nuns of Bruges took care of that. Do you ever go to Mass?" "Sometimes." "Then you're not a good Catholic, Julie." "No," said Julie, after a pause. "Not at all. But it sometimes catches hold of me." And that was the best-selling novel of 1903. This book was enjoyable and interesting. I didn't like it quite as much. It was pretty close, but I like some of the others I read a little bit better. But yeah, they've all been pretty much in the same keel, I guess, same level as far as I've been concerned. So if you have read these books, or if you're going to read these books, I definitely would love to hear your opinions. And I guess that's it. That will be enough for me for this week. Yes, again, have you read this book, or are you intrigued to read it? If you need a refresher course on the other books that have been on the list so far, there should be a playlist. I can link it down below or whatever, however that works. I'll figure it out. So, times are interesting here in America, ever more increasingly. So more than ever, if possible more than ever, there seems to be a need for art and for appreciating the art that we have. So go on with you and read more books and watch movies and take care of yourselves and each other. Just because I say it every time doesn't mean I don't mean it every time. I care about you very much. And like I said, that's enough for me. So I will see you next week.
Bye.